In this video, we're going to run down the settings available to you in your terrain resolution window. Now, to access this, first off, we need to have a terrain. So let's go under terrain and just create a basic terrain, which is huge by default. And let's say we want to change that or any of the other native aspects of a terrain. We can go under terrain and open up set resolution. Now, I should mention this, all of these settings you're going to want to have in place before you begin editing your terrain at all.
Right, because once you start modeling out and sculpting out your hills and mountains and stuff like that, and then further into painting textures on it, placing trees and rocks, if you come back here and change it, it's gonna either put those things in the wrong place, or in some cases, like your texture maps, throw them away altogether.
That's right. It'll end up wiping things out. So generally, it's a good idea to have all of this stuff decided upon before you get into the terrain designing process. Now, starting at the top, we have terrain width, height, and length. These are all pretty straightforward. These are sizes in meters for your terrain. So width and length are pretty huge by default. We have a total of, what is that, 2 kilometers? So we have a 4 square kilometer terrain. It's just absolutely massive. So I'm going to pull this down. Let's just go with something like 200 by 200. Now, when I click set resolution, our terrain will get significantly smaller, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and set the rest of these up first. Your terrain height is how high up into the air any feature of your terrain can possibly go before it plateaus out and gets flat. So right now we could have up to a 600 meter tall hill, but once we get to 600 meters, that's it. We will plateau out. We cannot go any higher than that. So we'll pull this down to only about 100. Next, we have height map resolution. Now, what is a height map, Lee?
Well, height map is basically a texture that is black and white, goes from black to white with all the shades of gray representing heights. In this case, where you've got your terrain height set to 100, white would be 100 meters high and black would be 0 meters high.
And then we have the height map resolution controls how detailed that map is. Now, there are some interesting, I guess you could call them rules in place for your height map resolution. So as you change this value, you're going to notice a very specific behavior. What's going on here?
Well, what happens is your terrain has to be a power of 2, meaning it has to be square. And it has to be a power of 2, meaning it has to be 32 by 32 or 64 by 64,
128, 512,
exactly.
And all those numbers.
Everything that you're used to. But in addition to that, Unity is automatically going to add 1 to that power of 2.
Now, speaking very generally, without getting too far into technical things, the reason for that additional pixel is that Unity is going to assign a single terrain vertex to each pixel of your height map. Now, if you think about your terrain kind of like a grid, if I told you to draw me a grid that had 10 grid spaces, just as an example, you would need 11 lines to do that. It would be n plus 1. That's what we're getting here. We have to have a resolution that is 1 square, 2, a power of 2, and it's going to be n plus 1. Now, if I set this to another value, say to, let's just say 1024, you'll notice we get 1025. But it's going to round to the nearest power of 2. So if I was to set this to, say, 700, it jumps back up to 1025 because it's the nearest power of 2 plus 1. Now, let's go ahead and pull that back down to, say, we can probably get away with 512 for the time being. Next, we have our detail resolution. This is another texture map that will, it'll be functioning under the hood. We'll never see this map by default.
But you can see the effects of it.
But you can see the effects of it. That's right. We can paint features down on our map, things like grass or rocks or little tiny physical details that are scattered across the surface. And this detail resolution controls the texture that will allow us to paint that placement down. The more detailed this texture is, the tighter the grouping we can have, the more detail we can have when we place down these types of meshes. If we pull this down really low, then our details, things like grass, will tend to be spaced out a little bit further. Now, down from here, we have detail resolution per patch. At the time of this recording, this is a newly exposed value inside of Unity 3, and there is not any significant documentation for it.
Right, other than the fact that it's been documented that it used to be hard-coded at a value of 8. There's nothing official from Unity about what this is or what it does. And there's a lot of speculation in the forums and Unity answers on what it does. So we're not going to mention what this may or may not do because we just don't know.
That's right. Now down from here we have the control texture resolution. This is something that you can expose and see this. This controls the resolution of your splat map. Now a splat map is a color-coded texture map in which each color you paint is associated with a particular texture. So as a case in point, we could paint down a red color in our splat map and associate the color red with grass. Then we could have a green color on our splat map that is associated with rocks. And so anywhere that was red, we'd see grass. Anywhere that was green, we'd see rocks. But internally, it's this very, very simple map with these really bright, brilliant colors. By controlling the texture resolution of that map, you can control how tightly we blend from one texture to another, which on your end, you're never going to see the splat map. You'll only see its results. You'll start off by laying down a base texture, say like a dirt texture, and then you're going to paint some grassy areas on top of that. What you're doing under the hood is you're controlling the splat map, but you're just going to see going from a rocky or a dirty texture to something like some grass.
Right, and the higher the resolution this is, the finer details you'll be able to paint onto your terrain.
That's right. Now, down here at the bottom, we have our base texture resolution. Eventually, as we start to move away from aspects of our terrain, the distant hills, so to speak, areas in our terrain that are far away, are going to stop using this splat map to determine what texture is showing where. It's all going to be baked out into a single texture, which will be assigned, and you can control the resolution of that distant texture here with your base texture resolution.
Right, it's a built-in optimization trick that Unity is using, so it doesn't have to calculate more than it has to.
That's right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take our control texture resolution. We'll pull this down to 256 to something a little bit simpler. And our base texture resolution can come down to 512. In fact, it could probably come a lot lower than that because we have a very small terrain. And then we'll click on Set Resolution, and you'll notice my terrain gets a lot smaller. And again, all of these settings that we have inside of here, you're generally going to want to set early on. These should be the first things that you decide upon. Now, if that's intimidating to you, I highly recommend you come in here and start playing with terrain, create a few basic terrains, paint, adjust some of these values, and see what you can and can't paint. See the kind of detail you get, say, for instance, out of a 513 height map resolution versus a 128 versus a 1024. Take a look at what happens when you grab your control texture resolution and pull it down really low and try to paint between two different textures and see what the result looks like. Only through doing this will you start to really get a solid grasp of, okay, here's generally what I need to have this set to before I get going, no matter how much we tell you how this works.
Right, and one of the things that you should make note of is you're going, well, why do I need to make these settings so low? Why don't I just max them all out? This is, again, a performance consideration. You want to use as little as you can, get the effect that you're going for to keep performance as fast as possible. We could show you doing all this at 2K textures, but performance and playback when you're painting your textures gets slow. Sculpting your terrain becomes even slower. So what you need to do ahead of time is figure out what you need the terrain for, how big it has to be, and then get the lowest numbers that will achieve the effect you're going for.
That's right, and I'll tell you straight out of the gate, the reason that we're setting all of these things so low is that because of our video demonstration, I don't want to have to wait a lot of time for to run a particular operation. We're going to be adding things like noise, and later on we'll be looking at all kinds of features of the terrain that are calculation heavy. And I don't want to wait through a really heavy calculation while we go through 4 kilometers worth of terrain at really high resolution. It will slow things down. So because I need that fast feedback while demonstrating this stuff, I'm using a very small terrain. And once again, I recommend that you come in here and try out different sizes of terrain and see what works for you, especially on your individual computer. But that's going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks for watching.